Right. Welcome to our first World Christianity Seminar this term, which is, as usual, co-hosted by the Center for Christianity, Cambridge Center for Christianity Worldwide, and the Faculty of Divinity here. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Adriaan van Klinken from Leeds. Been reading your stuff in some of my seminars, so even some of my students showed up to get to know you. So we're all very excited to have you here. No pressure at all. I've known you for a very long time. When people were still talking about women in Pentecostalism, you were saying, well, maybe there's something else going on, that men are also disciplined into their gender identity. Then you have more recently followed up with work on, well, your most recent book, Can a Christian Queer, looking at Pentecostal queer spaces in Africa. Again, a very creative and really interesting take on things. And you've come today to us with a new topic, which I think you've been on for about a year now, so more or less. I've heard you talk about it
last time I was in Cambridge.
Exactly. When you were at the Globant conference, you were speaking about that, and that is actually looking at a different form of theologizing, novels, and African novels, and how they view Christianity in Africa and questions of coloniality and so on. I should have also said, of course, by way of introducing, you're a professor of religion and African studies in Leeds, and you have come to spend a sunny day in Cambridge. So welcome. We very much look forward to your talk. About 45 minutes as usual, and then we'll have question and answers. For those of you who are online, and also for those of you in the room, we're recording this seminar, but for the recording itself, we're spotlighting Adriaan's video, and then the answers, discussion and answer will not be recorded. Over to you, Adriaan.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jörg, for the invitation to come to Cambridge, which is always a pleasure. And thank you all for coming on this very sunny day. I'm sure you can think of other and possibly better things to do, but on a day like this. And thanks to those of you joining online. I see a couple of faces, and wonderful to be in this physical and virtual reality at the same time. So, as Jörg mentions, my work over the past 10 years has kind of been exploring different topics and different approaches, I guess, to Christianity in Africa. I think there are connections between the kind of different topics and the different approaches that I have been working with, but that might be a question that comes up in the Q&A. So today I'd like to talk with you about a question: how we can study African Christianity through the lens of contemporary African literature. What is the significance? What are the methodological gains? What are the intellectual insights of using literary texts as an entrance in our thinking about Christianity in Africa today? I've had a long-standing interest in African literature, and actually, I think 10, 15 years ago or so, I ended up kind of at random writing an article about Ngugi's The River Between, which was my kind of first piece of writing on African literature. But only during COVID, when the research methods I have been working with for the past 10 years, mostly ethnographic and empirical methods, they were not available. So kind of I had to change my approach. And of course, developing a new area, a new approach takes time, which is why only COVID belongs to the past, kind of. I finally dare to talk about this project as my current book project. And I am able to travel for research now again, but it means that whenever I travel, I'm carrying a novel with me, which I'm reading for this project. Today is actually the first time that I'm publicly talking about this project as my current book project. I did talk about one of the novels I'm working with at the Globant conference here at Cambridge last year, which is not one of the novels I'm talking about today. So I'm really looking forward to the feedback, to the discussion, to the input that hopefully will help me to develop this project. What I'd like to do today is begin by giving a kind of a broader context for the study of Christianity in African literature, and second, to outline my own approach to this subject, And third, to discuss two novels as kind of examples of the kind of insights that are generated by focusing on Christianity in contemporary African novels. There is an existing body of scholarship on Christianity and African literature. However, this work does currently not constitute a field or a subfield on its own, but is in fact dispersed over a variety of fields, such as the study of African literature, the study of religion and literature, the study of African religions, and African theology. And in each of these fields, literature tends to be somewhat marginal. Interestingly, scholars in each of these four fields have recently underlined the need for a more systematic approach to Christianity in African literature. For instance, Suzanne Veltsch in the Cambridge Companion to Literature and Religion argues that the field of religion and literature suffers from a decided tilt towards texts and theories that are inflected. This is interesting, my slides are moving automatically. We are already at the end of my presentation. Is there a way of stopping that?
Yeah, skip that.
I mean, that's the best way to make sure that I finish within 45 minutes.
You've got me. Let's do this will work. And maybe just go back and see if it's auto or not.
Because it's
Score.
yeah.
Scroll to the beginning. Yeah.
Okay, let's see. So Suzanne Veltsch in the Cambridge Companion to Literature and Religion argues that the field of religion and literature suffers from a tilt towards texts and theories that are inflicted by Western Christianity and its aftermath. She highlights the need for engagement with Christianity in global South contexts, for reasons that I don't have to explain to involve Christianity's audience. In the study of African religions, Ezra Chitando, and I was just chatting to David about him, has observed that scholars have not devoted adequate time to analyze religious texts and religious themes that run through most African literature. And he calls for an increased engagement with literary writing in order for African religious studies to become truly multidisciplinary. In the field of African theology, Abraham Mangwa observed an overall lack of engagement by African theologians with the work of African creative writers. There are a couple of exceptions, but overall, he says there is this lack. And he argues that this is surprising because both theologians and writers share a deep affinity and common ground in their quest for African identity in the post-colony. This issue hasn't solved. We can let it go. In the study of African literature, it is telling that two recent major handbooks on African literature each have a chapter about Islam, but not about Christianity, which is peculiar as both faiths have more or less a similar following on the African continent, and Christianity is at least as prominent in African literature as Islam. So there seems to be a lack of interest in Christianity among literary scholars, and we can only speculate about the reasons for that. Of course, there is an existing body of scholarship on Christianity in African literature. And in fact, the journal Studies in World Christianity had a special issue about this topic with a focus on African literature in 2010, edited by Afe Arugane. Yet, this emerging body of scholarship is somewhat dispersed and fragmented, and it has a couple of limitations. First, it tends to focus on the so-called canonical texts of 20th century African writers, thus overlooking more recent texts by a new generation of writers. Second, as a result, it tends to be almost exclusively concerned with the history of Christian mission and its links to European colonialism, to kind of take that as its central problem. Third, it does not sufficiently reflect the contemporary dynamics in and the diversity of African Christianities and the new kind of questions that this raises. For instance, the enormous popularity of Pentecostal charismatic movements and their representation in contemporary literature has hardly been addressed. Fourth, the central concern of scholarship on this subject tends to do with the critique of Christianity in African literature, which is actually the title of the only monograph that I'm aware of explicitly covering this topic, which was written 3 decades ago by Justin Bogambi, The Critique of Christianity in East African Literature. So we tend to overlook the ways in which a current generation of writers engage Christianity in creative ways, as they reimagine Christian faith and explore its relevance for thinking through current African issues. Mid-20th century literary texts written in the era of political liberation and decolonization often engage with Christianity critically, associating it with the history of European colonialism, depicting it as a foreign religion, and exploring its disruptive effects on African social life and indigenous traditions and religions. Achebe's Things Fall Apart and Googie's The River Between are 2 classic examples of that approach. However, as the literary scholar Simon Bukandi has argued, after independence, the church could no longer be represented as a direct agent of colonialism or neocolonialism. Christianity could no longer be represented as a force extraneous to the African experience, but as a crucial part of the social and cultural fabric of post-colonial society. As I probably don't have to tell you, in the post-colonial period, the Christian demographics of the African continent has grown tremendously. Contemporary African Christianity is generally associated with significant levels of religious innovation and vitality, and is seen as a major cultural, social, and political factor in society. Indeed, Africa is now claimed to be the most Christian continent in the world, and Andrew Walls famously refers to African Christianity as perhaps the most representative Christianity of the 21st century. So these recent developments raise a new set of questions. Does the growth of Christianity in post-colonial Africa mean that it no longer is and should be seen as a colonizer of religion? What has enabled this change in perception of Christianity as a foreign, Western, to an African religion, to use Kwame Bediako's term? How is Christianity practiced in African communities today? What is its public significance and relevance? And how is the role that Christianity plays in contemporary African cultures and societies to be understood in relation to current social and political issues? And importantly, how are these developments and the new questions they raise addressed and engaged by African literary writers, in particular by a new generation of writers who grew up and lived at a time when African Christianity was undergoing these transformations? Using literary texts as a lens for the study of African and world Christianity compared to, say, ethnographic or other empirical methods is inventive, I think, because of the quality of literature, not to simply reflect, but to critique and reimagine social reality. The literary scholar Otto Kwesen speaks about literature as a calibration of society, and he develops an approach to literature that allows to read for the social, that is, using the literary text as a means towards social enlightenment. Adding to that, Wala Adebanyoni writes about the African literary writer as a social thinker who engage with the nature of existence and questions of knowledge in the continent. So building on those approaches to African literature, I ask how a current generation of African writers think about, think with, and or think against Christianity as part of their critical, creative, and imaginative engagement with current social, cultural, and political issues. Doing so, I suggest that literary texts are an important resource and method for the study of Christianity in post-colonial Africa as part of world Christianity at large. The importance of literature as a resource is in the potential of literature to represent the diversity and complexity of Christianity in post-colonial Africa, to critique particular manifestations of it and their socio-political impacts, and to creatively imagine and reimagine the alternative world-making potential of Christian beliefs and traditions. Literary texts engage with Christianity to address and reflect on current social concerns, ranging from gender-based violence, sexual diversity, interreligious relations, genocides, ecology, etc. They theorize these concerns via specific religious categories and symbols, such as prophecy, deliverance, prosperity, sacrifice, miracles, the cross and the Bible, and the whole range of other kind of symbols and notions that are central in the practice of Christianity in Africa today. My methodology in this project centers around an interreading of these social and religious vocabularies, and to explore the ways in which they are interlinked within the literary texts. So having outlined the context and the methodology of the project in general, let me demonstrate this approach by discussing two literary texts that I'm working with. And for the purpose of this talk, I've decided to focus on two novels by Nigerian female writers. And you have already been seeing my slides, so they don't come as a surprise. Adichie's Purple Hibiscus, and which is relatively well known, I think, for many people who are kind of familiar with African literature, and perhaps a more unfamiliar and a more recent novel, Under the Udana Trees by Chinelo Oparanta. These texts thematize different forms of Christianity in relation to issues of gender and sexuality, respectively. And that was right on the continuity with my between these two novels and the broader themes that I've been working with in the past comes in. Purple Hibiscus, Catholicism and Gender. Purple Hibiscus by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is a widely acclaimed novel, which has been recognized by many critics for its contribution to the field of religion and African literature. In particular, it addresses the question of the status of Catholicism as an originally missionary religion from Europe in a post-colonial African context. I sympathize with readings that foreground Adichie's complex narrative exploration and negotiation of the possibilities of Christianity, specifically Catholicism, in contemporary Nigeria. But I do believe that there is more to say about the novel than scholarship has done so far, especially in relation to questions of gender, which Adichie addresses through the figure of the Virgin Mary. Set in the 1990s, 2 decades after the end of the Biafra War, Purple Hibiscus sketches the context of a post-colonial Nigerian society in which Christianity has settled and become part of social cultural life. This is not a novel about the arrival of Christianity as a new religion brought by foreign missionaries, although a British missionary priest and white religious sisters are still present in its pages. Instead, it is about how an originally European religion takes shape in Igbo lands, Nigeria, in the late 20th century, more than 100 years after the first Catholic missionaries arrived there. The religious setting of the novel is dominated by Catholicism. The text narrates a Catholic religious universe with a domestic devotion centered around praying the rosary, weekly mass attendance, and a material religious culture of crucifixes, medals of the Virgin Mary, rosary beads, missals, and holy water. This universe characterizes the two families featured in the novel. The family of Papa Eugene, in which the protagonist, Kambili, grows up, and the family of Auntie Fiona. Yet in the latter family, Kambili and her brother Yaya discover a very different form of Catholicism when they get to spend time with their owners. Papa Eugene is depicted as a product of colonial missionary Christianity. He himself testifies to that, telling his children, "My father spent time worshipping gods of wood and stone. I will be nothing today but for the priests and sisters at the mission." A pious and successful businessman, Eugene is praised by the priests, held in high esteem by people in the community, and he even receives a Human Rights Award for publishing a pro-democracy newspaper. Yet, he also has another, darker side that Kambili, Yaya, and the mother, Beatrice, are painfully aware of. To them, he is an intimidating presence, in the home, whose will is law, and who exercises an overwhelming control and tyranny. So domestic and gender-based violence is one of the central social issues that are raised as a major theme in this novel. The depiction of Beatrice's character illustrates Ghanaian theologian Mercy Odioye's critical observation that Christianity in West Africa reinforces the cultural conditioning of compliance and submission and leads to the depersonalization of women. Catholic religion, Igbo tradition, and the Nigerian big man culture appear to strengthen a patriarchal power that provides Eugene with a quasi-divine status, which is one of the phrases used in the novel. Auntie Ifeoma, Eugene's sister, represents a very different form of Catholicism. She is a confident woman who stands up to her brother, and Jean, not being intimidated by his status and wealth. As a university lecturer, she encourages critical thinking, as reflected in her children. Like Eugene's family, Ifeoma's household is organized around Catholic devotion. They pray the rosary together as a family every night. But when Kambili and Yaya visit them for the first time, they are shocked, because after the last Hail Mary, their aunt and cousins collectively burst out in singing uplifting Igbo songs, which was not done both at their home and also in the parish that they attended to with their family, back at home. So the narrative depiction of family devotion at Auntie Ifeoma's, warm, joyful, communal, is in stark contrast to Eugene's home, where devotion is strict, sterile, and fearful. So Purple Hibiscus, through the variety of characters and the different ways in which they negotiate the relationship between Christianity and Igbo culture and religion, avoids a one-sided representation of Christianity, but narrates the possibilities of Catholicism transitioning from a colonial to an enculturated religion. Doing so, the novel explores questions that are central in the debate about enculturation, which of course is very central in Catholicism in Africa after Second Vatican Council. It explicitly raises the theological question of how to appreciate indigenous religion. Is indigenous worship a worshipping of gods of wood and stone, as Eugene has it, or is it as good as and the same as Catholics praying the Rosary, as Ifeoma suggests? Is the Igbo deity the same as the God of the Bible? And can the Virgin Mary be asked to intercede and offer healing to Kambili's grandfather, who never converted to Christianity, who is, in his son's words, a heathen? In exploring these questions, Adichie's sympathy appears to be with a progressive and liberal interpretation, in which indigenous religion is not demonized, but recognized as valuable and sacred. The novel does suggest that the process of enculturation is not yet complete. There's a really interesting anecdote, part of the novel, where Amaka, Kambili's cousin, is preparing for confirmation, but then is told by the priest of their parish that she needs to choose an English name in order to be confirmed, but she refuses, so she's not confirmed in the novel. So the character of Amaka appears to be one of the most radical in critiquing the church's ongoing colonial Eurocentric tendencies. African women theologians have warned that enculturation runs the risk of indigenous and Christian patriarchies reinforcing each other. Yet Purple Hibiscus suggests that this is not necessarily the case. In Musa Buba's words, Ifeoma's household presents a decolonizing feminist space of liberation. In this space, Jaya and Kambili are exposed to another view of parenting, another view of Catholicism, another view of African indigenous belief system, another view of life. Somewhat surprisingly, however, Dubé, in her gendered reading of the novel, leaves completely unmentioned the figure of the Virgin Mary, which is central in the novel's decolonizing feminist narrative of Catholicism. References to Mary abound throughout the novel, illustrating Nigerian theologian Akon Odubanto's observation that devotion to Mary has caught on like bushfire across the Catholic landscape in Africa. Interestingly, this phenomenon of Marian devotion has received very little attention in the study of Christianity in Africa, and also has received very little attention in the scholarship about this novel. So one key contribution of Purple Hibiscus is that it provides a literary representation of Marian devotion as an important part of Catholicism as a lived religion in Nigeria. The two forms of Catholicism featured in the novel each have their own version of the Virgin Mary. Describing Mass in their local parish church, Kambili depicts her father kneeling to receive communion at the marble altar with a bronze, life-size Virgin Mary mounted nearby. This illustrates the reverence of whiteness that was typical for that parish church, still led by a British missionary priest, and of course, a devotion that was a reverence of whiteness that is typical of Eugene, Kambili's father. Eugene's act of kneeling for the statue symbolizes his devotion to a white colonial Christianity. Even his self-invented Marian title, Our Lady, Shield of the Nigerian People, appears not to reflect so much an attempt to contextualize Mary in Nigerian context, but it seems to reflect a belief that Nigeria's problems can only be solved through intervention by a white European colonial symbol of spiritual power. Ifeoma's practice of Catholicism also centers around Mary, and so does the devotional life of her family. Ifeoma and her family pray to the Virgin Mary for healing for their grandfather, who is not a Christian, leaving Kambili in shock because she asks, how can the Virgin intercede on behalf of the healing? Being familiar with the blonde Mary at her own parish church, at Auntie Ifeoma's house, Kambili is for the first time confronted with the possibility of a black Mary, when faced with a painting made by her cousin Amaka. In a later conversation, Amaka argues that it is about time for Our Lady to come to Africa. Don't you wonder, she asks, how come that Mary always appears in Europe? She was from the Middle East, after all. The statement elicits her brother, Obiara, the question whether Mary has become a political virgin, and the whole discussion leaves Kambili baffled. At the end of the novel, Auntie Ifeoma takes Amaka and Kambili on pilgrimage to Aokpa, the village that has turned into a popular shrine after a local girl started to see visions from the beautiful woman. This part of the story captures an actually existing phenomenon. In southeast Nigeria, there is a tradition of Marian apparitions starting in 1992. A dedicated chapel was established on that site by the diocese and officially consecrated in 2019, in an attempt by the church to domesticate that miracle. Purple Hibiscus captures the early popularity of the shrine in the mid-1990s, before it had been officially approved and recognized by the church. It narrates the excitement of the faithful about the apparitions, despite the lack of official church approval. Visiting the crowded site, Kambili has her own vision of Mary. The event is narrated in the imagery of biblical revelation scenes, where the natural elements support and mediate the manifestation of the spiritual. Then I saw her, the Blessed Virgin, an image in the pale sun, a red glow on the back of my hands, a smile on the face of the rosary with that man. She was everywhere. The apparition scene places the Virgin Mary decisively in an African world. She is not the blue-eyed blonde figure of St. Agnes, Kambili's parish church, but instead is associated with the Nigerian landscape and people. The suggestion that Mary is omnipresent, everywhere, can be seen as a criticism of attempts by the church to control and domesticate her. To what extent is Mary, who appears to Kambili, a political virgin, to use the phrase used in the novel? Later in the novel, Amaka writes to Kambili about coverage of the apparition in an American magazine. The writer had sounded pessimistic that the Blessed Virgin Mary could appear at all, especially in Nigeria. All that corruption and all that heat. Impossible. The suggestion here is that Mary appearing in Nigeria is politically significant, as it counters racist and colonial stereotypes that continue to represent the African continent as the heart of darkness. As such, Purple Hibiscus affirms African identity and pride, reclaiming Africa as a continent where divine revelation and spiritual enlightenment can and does happen. Most importantly, the story of Kambili receiving the vision of Mary in an outdoor setting, not controlled by the church, mediated through natural elements, affirms female religious agency outside the contours of patriarchy and church authority. This is further confirmed by the fact that it is Auntie Ifioma who validates the vision by saying, Kambili is right, something from God was happening there. So, Purple Hibiscus is an important text in my reading as a narrative account of Catholicism, inculturation, and gender. It is an original text, specifically because of its contribution to the inculturation of the Virgin Mary, presenting a creative narrative reimagining of Mary in the Nigerian landscape. The novel demonstrates Adichie's awareness of the different theological and political possibilities in Catholicism. With regard to gender politics too, the novel plays with different possibilities. It obviously critiques a form of religion that is both colonial and patriarchal, and it uses the figure of the Black Mary appearing in Nigeria to reimagine a localized version of Catholic faith that is empowering to women. And this, through the narrative of the Marian apparition, the vision of Mary to Kambili, that Kambili herself, when it makes a transition from being a very docile girl to actually becoming a mature woman and finding her voice. So through the vision of Mary, she finds her own voice and finds her agency. So the second novel I'd like to talk about is Under the Udala Trees by Chinelo Operonta. In recent years, issues of same-sex sexuality have been featured prominently in African Christian circles, with Christianity often being seen as a driving force of social, political, and religious homophobia. And I only have to refer to the very recent developments in Uganda to bring that to mind. African literary writers have also recently engaged with the hitherto controversial theme of same-sex relationships. And a fascinating text that intersects these two themes, Christianity and sexual diversity, is this book, Under the Udala Trees. The setting of the novel, like Purple Hibiscus, is southeast Nigeria, Igbo lands, in the years immediately during and after the Biafran War. This historic setting is significant, I think, because Biafra was a watershed moment in Nigerian post-colonial history, representing a battle about Nigerian nationhood. So it seems that Operonta suggests that the current battle about same-sex issues is as divisive and as fundamental to understanding Nigerian identity as the Biafra War. The novel was written at a time that Nigeria's then president, Goodluck Jonathan, signed the same-sex marriage prohibition bill into law in 2014. And the author, in the epilogue to the novel, explicitly acknowledges that through this text, she attempts to give Nigeria's marginalized LGBTQ citizens a more powerful voice and a place in the nation's history. So this novel, perhaps more so than Purple Hibiscus, is an explicit example of Wala Adebambi's notion of the African writer as a social thinker, directly intervening in political debates, in this case in relation to sexuality, but also in relation to Christian faith. Christianity is a major theme in the novel. No particular denomination is explicitly mentioned, but the novel sketches a religious culture of fervent worship, intense prayer, and conservative biblical interpretation. And it reflects, or it creates the impression of the wave of Pentecostal revival that at that time was coming up in Nigeria, described by Matthews Ojo as the emergence of an end-time army. That was the culture that Ioma, the protagonist, grew up in, and which she had to navigate while coming to terms with her sexuality. The space of the church is a prominent one in the life works in Under the Udala Trees, and a paradoxical one for that matter. Some critics of the novel emphasize Operonta's critique of the church and her questioning of the credibility of the church as a safe haven for all people. But in my reading, the novel renders the space of the church and of Christian faith more generally much more ambiguous.
Okay.
Throughout the
Thanks a lot.
text,
That was productive. Thank you. Right.
through the text, we find Ifioma going to church, initially as part of the weekly routine of her family, but later as a place where she is drawn to herself. She seeks refuge and comfort there, and desperately tries to pray away her sexual desires, which she has been socialized to see as sinful. Yet as much as the church is the space where she struggles with her sexuality, it is also the space where she has her first encounter with a community of same-sex loving women. Her girlfriend, Ndidi, takes her to a club that is hidden in a covered church called Friends of Jesus, Church of God. So this name seems to be a rather subversive suggestion that Jesus is a friend of same-sex loving people. These conflicting meanings of church in the novel can be seen as an allusion to the complex relationship of Christianity to same-sex sexuality. For Ifioma, the church, and in particular the culture of Pentecostal prayer, deliverance, and Bible study, is presented as a hindrance in the process of coming to terms with her sexuality. It is her mother, Adriaan, who in the novel represents this Christian anti-gay stance. When the mother finds out about Ifioma's sexuality, she hands her daughter a black prayer scarf as a mark of true penitence and prays to God to protect her daughter from the demons that are trying to send her to hell. Similar prayers are repeated throughout the novel, as an illustration of Mimi van Bogen's point that the prayer language of Nigerian Pentecostals drips with blood and violence. The voices of the prayer warriors thunder across the face of the earth as they speed towards heaven. But those kind of prayers don't have an immediate effect. And as a result of that, Adriaan, Ifioma's mother, performs a ritual of deliverance, trying to exorcise the demonic spirits that she believes holds possession over her daughter. In the name of God Almighty, I order you to come out. I order you to leave my child alone. She was speaking to the devil, crying for him to turn back and leave me alone. I order you to leave. The belief that demonic forces can infiltrate the body, leading it into sin and making it impure, is widespread in African Pentecostal Christian circles. And homosexuality in particular is often associated with the devil and seen as a form of spiritual bondage. The Pentecostal deliverance of the queer body has indeed become a common theme in recent Nigerian queer literary texts. Yet in this novel, the deliverance, like the prayers, has no effect. The suggestion being that the queer body doesn't need deliverance. Likewise, Ifioma's failure to pray, or even to utter the word Amen in response to her mother's prayers, suggests that perhaps such prayers do not need to be prayed in the first place, because same-sex attraction is not a reason to beg God for forgiveness. One prayer, and I think it's actually the only prayer in the novel that is being answered, is born out of confusion, where Ioma is no longer sure whether or not her sexuality is a sin. She articulates this as follows: Lord, I am confused. Please give me a sign. If there is any evil in my heart, please give me a sign so that I might recognize it and doing so avoid it. And the answer to that prayer comes in two forms in the novel. Sunlight breaks through the window in the church where Ioma is seated, and she sees that as a sign of God's presence, which affirms her. Second, her mother enters the church, just after she has prayed this prayer, which leads Ioma to the conclusion, if this was God's sign, then Mama was the evil in my heart. So the suggestion seems to be that if Ioma needs to be delivered from anything in order to grow towards her real self, it is from her homophobic mother, who hinders her process towards maturity. So instead of prayer being a tool to control sinful desires, for Ioma it turns out to be a method in which she gradually comes to accept her desire. Woven through the narration of Phil's prayer and deliverance is the story of Bible study that Ioma receives from her mother, After her mother finds out about her daughter's sexuality, she takes her onto a journey of daily Bible studies where in a period of 6 months, they read through the whole Bible from Genesis to Revelation. The prominence of the Bible and Adora's, Iona's mother, rather fundamentalist approach to it, reflects the status and role of the Bible among the Igbo people more generally. As the Igbo biblical scholar Anthony Nokpa puts it, Christianity is the religion of the book in Igbo land. Much of Igbo Christianity can be summarized by the phrase, is it in the Bible? Clearly, homosexuality for most Igbo, possibly for most Nigerian Christians, as represented by Adorno, is not in the Bible. Iona's mother uses the Genesis creation story of Adam and Eve to argue to her daughter that it is man and wife, Adam and Eve, adding that if God wanted it to be otherwise, would he not have included it in that other way in the Bible? Likewise, reading the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, her mother draws the lesson that man must not lie with man, and if man does, man will be destroyed. These and other clever verses are quoted by Adorno to underline that homosexuality is something disgusting, disgraceful, a scandal. So the character of Adorno appears to be what Moussa Dube describes as a colonized mind. She rigidly adopts the Bible, introduced by European missionaries, as an authoritative, sacred scripture, and forgets about the indigenous traditions of what have been described as female Igbo gender bending, which were opposed by the same missionaries. However, where her mother intends the Bible study lessons as a space to teach her daughter the biblical truth regarding her forbidden desire, for Iona, those Bible study sessions become a space to question her mother's interpretation. So, for instance, in the conversation they have about the creation story, Iona wonders, just because the story happens to focus on a certain Adam and a certain Eve, doesn't mean that all other possibilities are forbidden. What if Adam and Eve are morally symbols of companionship? And Eve, different from him, woman instead of man, was simply a tool by which God knows that companionship is something you get from a person outside yourself. So the novel reinterprets the Genesis account of creation and its popular interpretation in debates around sexuality. It takes Adam and Eve as a narrative model, not of gender complementarity or compulsory heterosexuality in marriage, but of human difference, companionship, and relationality that can be found and enjoyed in multiple, equally viable forms. Oparanta advances through the novel a queer biblical interpretation upon the literature. And what was interesting is that she does so in a distinctly Igbo style, by engaging with the motive of the Udara tree, which is of course central in the title, and that appears through the novel. I don't have time to go in detail here, but in my kind of reading, the Udara tree, which is sacred in Igbo indigenous culture, resembles the biblical tree of knowledge from the Genesis creation story. In the novel, the symbolic meaning of the Udara tree merges with that of the biblical tree of knowledge. The tree becomes a symbol of losing innocence, gaining knowledge and maturity, and exploring new ways of being fruitful. Where the Bible is often used to reinforce conservative attitudes towards sexual diversity, Iona offers an alternative angle to this Christian sacred text. Somewhere in the novel, she thinks aloud, saying, change is a major part of God's aesthetic of the world, of God's vision for the world. The Bible itself is an endorsement of change. Maybe the rules of the Bible will always be in flux. Maybe God is still speaking and will continue to do so for always. Maybe God is still creating new covenants, but we are too deaf, too headstrong, too set in old ways to hear. So the suggestion of Oparanta through the figure of Iona is to present a more open-minded and a more flexible and understanding of God and of faith that is actually open to change, to new attitudes, new ideas, new views. Even Iona's mother, who throughout the novel uses the language of abomination and deliverance in relation to her daughter, at the end of the story concludes, God who created you must have known what he did. So Operanta's suggestion is not only that God is open to change, that the Bible is not static and unchangeable, but that even conservative and initially homophobic Christians can be transformed in their minds and attitudes. As much as he acknowledges that Christianity has historically been the greatest platform in which homosexuality has been condemned, through the novels she creatively explores the possibility of an alternative imagining of Christian faith in relation to sexuality. So to wrap up the discussion of these two novels, if you give me a few more minutes. Both these novels center around, continue the debate and the theme around Christianity and colonialism, which of course follows a long tradition in African literature. The point being how Christianity, even in the post-colonial context, continues to shape colonized minds. However, these two novels innovate this critique by linking it specifically to issues of gender and sexuality, which are marginal, to say the least, I think, in the more 20th century classical texts. Purple Hibiscus is concerned with the critique of colonial, patriarchal Catholic Christianity, while Under the Udala Trees is concerned with the critique of a Pentecostalized Christianity, which, however modern it might look like, has bought into a colonizing heteronormative and homophobic narrative. Both novels also demonstrate that Christianity is not tied to its colonial past and its ongoing colonizing tendencies. By demonstrating how Christian beliefs, symbols, and texts can be appropriated from marginalized perspectives and be reinterpreted, Adichie and Operanta contribute to a decolonial imagining of Christianity in Nigeria. By linking this specifically to issues of gender and sexuality, they not only imagine a decolonial Christianity, but also one that is feminist and queer affirming. They do this in ways that are perhaps more bold, creative, and imaginative than most African theologians have done so far. In that sense, you could make an argument about reading African literature as a form of African theology. Both novels present Christianity in its Catholic and Pentecostal forms, respectively, not as static and unchangeable, but instead of fields of debate, ongoing contestation, and multiple interpretations. They deploy central symbols from these traditions, such as the Virgin Mary in Catholicism, in the Bible, in Pentecostalism, subjecting these to creative reinterpretation in a quest for what Basin calls a calibration of the social, as well as of the religious. Both novels demonstrate how Christianity as a public religion is subjected to public critique in literary texts, but also how it is creatively reimagined. So if African Christianity, in the words of Andrew Walls, is the representative Christianity of the 21st century, then these two novels demonstrate how Christianity is an ever-evolving field, which future trajectories are still being crystallized. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Adriaan, for an inaugural insight into your project. I'm very honored that you bring it here and present it for discussion. It's really lovely to hear